So hopefully should have a pop-up on your screen just to
I
let
have, yeah.
everybody know that's being recorded. Brilliant. Okay. So my name's Elise Freeman and I'm here today with my colleague Rebecca Zirk. We're co-leads with Dewis Choice and we're based at the Centre for Age, Gender and Social Justice at Aberystwyth University. This morning's session, our project is quite broad. So I will cover some background on the project before we go into the main part of the session. But the focus of this morning's session is looking at using co-production as a method of research and development with older LGBTQ plus survivors of domestic abuse. So they're a group really where they've been quite hidden in terms of their visibility and research and services. So after I've given a bit of an introduction to Dewis Choice in general, Rebecca will be going into some depth on the co-production that was used with this group. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping to start us off. And mainly, we do encourage people to contribute to the session. We're quite a small group, so we will have quite a bit of scope for discussion and to answer questions. Please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and we have built in time to stop and respond to the questions, but we also will have some opportunity for group discussion built in as well. Just a reminder again that the session is being recorded. Any case studies that we're discussing throughout the session, we've fully anonymised. We'd appreciate that then if you would do the same. So do feel free to draw on your experiences and your practices, but please anonymize anything that you share. Um, Also, a bit of a health warning. So, the session discusses some emotive subjects, including domestic abuse, physical violence, and sexual abuse. We won't be going into great depth on these, but particularly the video we'll be showing later on comes from directly from survivors' experiences, and the language is quite emotive in that film. It's perfectly normal for people to feel impacted by these subjects, even if it's an area that you're working in your day-to-day work. But please do feel free to take a break. So protect your well-being. If you need to duck out for a short period, take a break from the screen, please do feel free to do so. So, just a bit of background really about Dewis Choice to begin with. So, Dewis Choice is the first initiative globally that combines longitudinal research with a bespoke co-produced service for older victim survivors of domestic abuse. And we provide intensive long-term support for female, male, and non-binary victim survivors. And these are aged 60 years and above, and they come into us via referral. The majority of our referrals come through either the police or through our safeguarding team locally or through social workers, with some also coming in through routes through health and through domestic abuse providers. And we provide support for these older victim survivors from crisis through to recovery. Generally, that is around 18 months, but we don't put an upper limit on the time period for support. And we have had a few older victim survivors stay with us for several years. One's been with us for 4 years now, still receiving support. So it really does reflect a sort of quite a holistic approach and reflect the needs and wishes of those older adults. As part of the service, the older victim survivors coming in for support are offered the opportunity to engage directly with the research team. And the learning from this engagement is used to produce academic publications, to develop training, and also to produce toolkits for practitioners, and these come in a variety of forms. So we have an ebook called Transforming the Response to Older Victim Survivors of Domestic Abuse, and you can access that from our website on the resources page. But there are also toolkits on there specifically around safety planning with older victim survivors, around the coexistence of dementia and domestic abuse, and around the group that we'll be looking at in more detail today, the older LGBTQ plus victim survivors. There's co-produced films and podcasts and animations that are all available free to access on our resource page as well. So alongside of the resources we develop, we also provide expert input to shape policy and strategy development in these areas. So a few examples being we develop some content for the statutory guidance that accompanied the new Domestic Abuse Act. We help inform our local policy development, particularly in relation to adult family abuse. We sit on several of the working streams developing our violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence strategy here in Wales. And we also give input to domestic homicides involving older victims. So in terms of looking at the older group and how we first developed our service for working with older victim survivors, past research at the centre really highlighted that older victims experience systemic ageism, sorry, and little was known about their experiences of domestic abuse. So there were significant gaps in data collection and research on older people and their experiences of domestic abuse, whether this be abuse perpetrated by intimate partners, ex-intimate partners, or adult family members. So when the abuse involved an older person, it was situated under an umbrella term of elder abuse. And this really had an effect of homogenizing older people. So when we were looking at sort of anybody really over the age of 59, if their experiences were described, they were all just described as older people who were experiencing abuse. And actually, we found this as a really diverse group, reflecting lots of different demographics, just the same as it would with younger age groups. And this group has an age span of 40 plus years with very different lived experiences and needs. So, considering what a response would look like to a 60-year-old compared to an 80, 85-year-old would be the same as thinking that a response should be the same between a 20-year-old and a 50-year-old. It's going to look very different, and their experiences will have been very different. So one of the issues with the way older people were looked at and domestic abuse and the gaps in the data and the research available has really meant that there's been significant gaps in service provision. So older people generally have poor visibility in domestic abuse service provision compared to their younger counterparts. And when they do access services, often services don't reflect their needs adequately because the services have been developed on research into particularly younger women experiencing intimate partner abuse from a male partner, and also those fleeing with children. So the Dewis Choice service was developed over a 12-month period. And as I said, this deployed co-production as a method of developing this to ensure that we got the right fit that reflected older people's needs. So the work was carried out with older people directly, with practitioners, and with the research team here at Dewis. And it involved ongoing work with two design groups, and these were formed in a rural and an urban area to ensure that the service was sensitive and responsive to localized needs. And this was also combined with a mapping exercise of the two areas to look at the population demographic and the availability of community services and infrastructure, which look different across the two areas. The groups explored healthy relationships in the context of later life. And this is an area that's really, again, underdeveloped with older people and their relationships with intimate partners and family members. So we know that there's been some fantastic work looking at healthy relationships, particularly with school age children and young people, but very little around this older age group. So, in addition to the design group work, we held a series of focus groups, and these were held with a broad range of older people. And they included unpaid carers, people from the University of the Third Age, and groups specifically formed around specific health conditions. So, for example, we met with a female group of cancer survivors and some groups from macular degeneration and Parkinson's disease. So, as the service began to develop with the input from these groups, the co-production started to sort of kick off really with the older victim survivors as well. So as the older victim survivors engaged with the service and then came through to start engaging with the research, they were involved in ongoing research interviews. They were invited to have membership on our steering group and also to input and into the development of the service and to evaluate the service as an ongoing dynamic process. And this enabled us to shift and expand the service in response to that input from our victim survivors. They also oversaw the production of some of our resources, so they helped in the putting together of these resources, what they'd look like, but also evaluated the resources ongoing as well to ensure that we were really truly reflecting their experiences when we were putting the resources out. Okay. So I just want to pause to take some comments in the chat at this point, actually. In what does co-production mean to you? It may be that some of you have used co-production through your research and in your practice, but what does that term co-production mean to you? There's no right or wrong answer, so do feel free just to be quite explorative with it.
If people prefer, they can turn off their mics.
I think there are some comments for it coming through in the
I
chat
see it
now.
as working with people and creating services with people. So it's a collaborative initiative.
Yeah, so working directly with people, so not sort of producing something on their behalf, but ensuring that they've got that input in the development stages and throughout. So it's collaborative is a really good term. We've got also coming in the chat from Alicia, working in conjunction with victim survivors. Yeah, and I think there's been a really good development in sort of survivor engagement networks and ensuring that we are working with victim survivors with response to domestic abuse and sexual violence. What we've have seen is that until fairly recently, there's been very little of this work going on with older victim survivors. So that is beginning to improve. There just seems to be much more awareness and an attempt as well to engage with them and draw them into these frameworks. Okay. Has anybody else got anything they'd like to add to that before we move on? Rebecca, did you want to add anything there or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So co-production really is becoming more known about really and more used. So it's becoming one of the most appealing mechanisms now to bring about positive change across public services, policy, and social research. But in terms of what we mean by co-production, that can look quite different. So it does mean delivering public services to different. Oops, I think I've jumped. If I jump forward, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Um, yeah, so it means deliberate public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals and people using those services and their families and their neighbours. So there can be, we have seen sometimes there's been a bit of a nod to co-production, and sometimes this has looked more like consultation than co-production. So going into a group and saying, "Oh, this is what we think you need, and this is what we'd like to do for you. Can we now have some feedback on that?" So true co-production really is coming before you get to that stage really, and actually saying to people, what are your experiences, what are your needs, what would work for you, and actually having people right involved at the start and coming up with those solutions, but then also going through a quite an ongoing reflective practice of revisiting what that looks like as it develops. So in terms of the key characteristics of co-production, it promotes ownership and voice, offering stakeholders greater control at each stage of the process. It also clearly recognises that those who are affected by a problem are best placed to help solve it. This is something we've particularly found with our older clients, and as I said, going back to what we mentioned at the beginning, where older people can be homogenized. It's not a one size fits all. And what's really come through from our ongoing co-production with the older victim survivors that we work for is that it's a very holistic response that they're looking for, that it reflects that individual need. It also aims to be collaborative with individuals and give them the opportunity and resources to act as their own catalyst for change. So we have again seen with our older victim survivors that sometimes when they're engaging with a service, they're offered sort of a service response out of a toolkit, which doesn't always fit to their needs. So it is being able to bend and shape those resources and be quite flexible and creative to meet the needs. And it instills a genuine sense of belonging to ensure equity of voice to all parties. And that is probably one of the most challenging parts of co-production, is sometimes when we're going in with a group, we can go in as the ones holding the power and the knowledge. So it's really equipping the people engaging with the co-production processes with that power and knowledge to feel like they've got that equity of voice, and try and remove some of that power dynamic. So I'm going to just in a moment hand over to Rebecca, who's going to go into much more depth now about the work with the older LGBTQ plus victim survivors and the making of the film. But before I do that, I'm just going to pause for a moment to see if anybody wants to ask any questions more broadly about Dewis Choice before we focus on that area. Feel free to unmute if you'd rather ask a question than pop it in the chat. Okay. Oh, nothing coming through. So I'll hand over. You share your screen, will you, Rebecca?
Yeah, if that's all right, thank you.
Yep. Okay, I'll stop sharing mine.
Okay, fab. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, great. Okay, so as Elise has just outlined around Dewis Choice, co-production is really at the heart of everything that we do on the project. Today we're going to take a deep dive into looking at how we co-produced a film called Do You See Me with older LGBTQ plus individuals. We're going to have, first of all, situate why we needed to do this project, look at the political backdrop, the current research framework, and look at some of the challenges we had when first exploring this issue. And then we're going to take you through step by step what we did to come up with the end product of the short film, and then how we could then meaningfully disseminate our research findings through exploring this issue. So hopefully through the session this morning, you'll be able to identify the key characteristics really within our co-production, how maybe you could use them within your own practice or through your own learning, and some of the challenges that we faced along the way as well. So just to begin with then, what does LGBTQ plus mean? Well, it's an acronym that's used to collectively describe a wide range of sexualities and gender identities that fall outside of a heteronormative societal construct of heterosexuality. So when two opposites sexes are attracted to one another, and cisgender. So when someone is identifying, so for example, I was born a female, and I identify as a female, so I would be regarded as cisgender. And the LGBTQ plus really stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, or anyone really who falls outside of that heterosexual identity. We know that when it comes to later life, there is a, a tendency really to desexualize older people, and they're not really given adequate consideration in terms of their relationships, their sexuality, or their gender identity. And often they are invisible in terms of the presentation in services, whether that be health, social care, or even domestic abuse services. Um, and so very little is known about their lived experiences in general. But then when we start to look at the lived experiences of domestic abuse, it's even more invisible. So in terms of our the kind of political landscape and helping to really situate this project and why we were doing what we were doing, there is a significant evidence gap in terms of our understanding. We know that domestic abuse responses right across the UK have been developed really in terms of global strategies to end all forms of gendered violence against women, underpinning by a large body of research. But that research generally focuses on female victimization and male perpetration within those intimate relationships. And as such, that kind of political ideological framework of violence against women is quite narrow in its focus, in that only females are really perceived as victims and males as perpetrators. And therefore, it's often that research is centered around often a younger woman, a woman with a family within this kind of heterosexual relationship. She's cisgendered and often from a middle class background. And to some extent, that is quite understandable given what we know about the proportionality and the nature of gender-based violence. But the problem really there is that for LGBTQ plus people, they're then often overlooked and their experiences are not at that forefront. There is an argument that the focus on gender is maybe too narrow and risks creating gaps within responses to victim survivors who fall outside of what is termed as a public story of domestic abuse. And that their experiences really around older age, sexual orientation and gender identity are overlooked. So there is this real paucity in terms of research capturing the voices of older LGBT people, and this really then restricts our knowledge and understanding of their lived experiences. But it's also really problematic in terms of constructing new ways of knowledge, new ways of understanding the problem, and then influencing that kind of domestic abuse policy response and also services that are set up to support victim survivors of domestic abuse. Now, as Elise said, we do know that in recent years there's been a greater emphasis really to include survivors' voices to help inform policy and practice responses. But the diversity of those voices is somewhat limited. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner conducted a report and looking at survivor engagement, and she'd identified through that work that often older people and then LGBTQ people, their voices are often not captured throughout that survivor engagement framework. So it's not surprising, really, that domestic abuse service provision in England and Wales has been criticised for not meeting the needs of older people, but also criticised for not meeting the needs of LGBTQ plus people. And we know that there is very limited uptake of these domestic abuse services by these populations. So, for example, Safe Lives, they looked at survivors accessing domestic abuse services across all of England and Wales, and they identified only 2.5% were LGBTQ plus individuals. And this is despite really what studies are suggesting that LGBTQ people are as likely, if not more likely, to experience domestic abuse than their heterosexual counterparts. And then when you add the intersection of age on top of that, gender and sexuality, the LGBT Foundation, who is a specialist domestic abuse LGBT service, found that older LGBT people were only representative of 0.1% of all of their service users. So there's a huge invisibility, really, for older LGBT victims accessing both generic services, but also specialist LGBTQ plus domestic abuse services. And there's really a need for greater awareness around older LGBTs lived experiences, around the barriers and enablers that support these group individuals to access practitioners and also help and support. And it's really within this political landscape that we positioned ourselves and the need to understand more about the lived experiences of older LGBTQ plus people. That's quite a mouthful, that is, LGBTQ plus. So sorry, you will have to forgive me because I will be saying it numerous times throughout this presentation. Okay, so just to look at kind of what we currently know about the scale of the problem. We know from the limited research that is available that LGBTQ plus people are at increased risk of victims being a victim of crime compared to the general population. And this includes victimization of domestic abuse. Despite growing evidence and recognition that they experience domestic abuse, they're often really hidden in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of statutory services and generic services. And there's limited data really on their prevalences. But what we do know is, and this is across all age groups, it's not specific to older people, is that 1 in 4 lesbian and bisexual women have experienced domestic abuse in an intimate relationship. So that's similar to those of their heterosexual counterparts. We also know that 43% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women have experienced rape, violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. That half of all gay men and bisexual men have experienced at least one incident of domestic abuse from a family member or intimate partner since the age of 16. So we're seeing higher rates there in terms of male victimisation than their heterosexual counterparts. 80% of transgender people have experienced some form of domestic abuse from a partner or ex-partner. And as I mentioned earlier, despite this prevalence, only about 2.5% of those are accessing specialist support, and of which only 0.1 are aged 60 years and older. So we really wanted to look at these lived experiences because we knew that there was a gap in terms of policy and practice. But we were presented with a number of challenges before we were able to do that. Um, so we didn't really understand the problem because there was a lack of research data and literature. So although I've just showed you very briefly, some of the prevalence rates for LGBT, they're not specific to older people. And actually, to try and disaggregate data around older LGBT people is just not possible really, because there's often limitations in being able to do that with the data sets that are available, and also the number of older LGBT people recorded is very, very minimal. So we didn't really have much to go off in terms of the research data and the literature. There is a growing body of literature around LGBTQ plus experiences of abuse, but again, with that intersection of older age, this it's just not there. There's no dedicated specialist service that supports older LGBTQ plus individuals. And so traditionally, when we conduct research, we will approach service providers and we will ask if there's any of their service users who would like to speak to us as part of our research project. However, we knew that they're not accessing domestic abuse services. There's no specialist services for them. So that kind of method of recruiting older LGBT people was cut off for us really, and that wasn't an option. So we had to think more creatively in terms of how we was going to access these individuals to learn about their lived experiences. Um, but we also knew, given that there was no one currently within service provision, that they were experiencing additional barriers to disclosure, but also to seeking help and support. So I want to put this question out to you as a group, really, and say, okay, so we know that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We know that we need to understand the lived experiences of LGBT people. But how can we possibly start to explore this when our traditional ways of accessing that population of survivors is not available, really? Please feel free to turn your mic off, and if you have any suggestions, and there is no right or wrong answer here. It's just your thoughts on, conducting a exploratory piece of work to examine a really hidden group, really. Is anything coming through in the chat, Elise?
Yes, yeah. And just give people an opportunity to type.
See the chat. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah.
Fab.
Just bear with her, just give people a chance to type.
Yep, no problem. I might just stop sharing a moment so I can see the chat too.
Okay, so Danielle has mentioned linking in with community groups and services.
Yeah. Work with other sectors in multidisciplinary. Sorry, Emma said to work with other
Yeah,
sectors in a multidisciplinary way to
to
identify people.
identify people. Yeah.
Yeah, great suggestions. The linking in with community groups. that's also really challenging as well for older LGBTQ plus people, because we know that older LGBTQ plus people are not always out in all spheres of their lives, and particularly as they age. Through this research, we've have found out that sometimes people report going back into the closet, so concealing really that gender identity or sexuality through fear of being discriminated against because of that. And we attended a Pride in Care conference where a story was told of an older gay man who his partner had passed away. And he required care and support needs. Um, and for fear of discrimination, he had burnt all his memorabilia, anything that could potentially suggest he was gay. He'd burnt it all through extreme fear, really, that he would be discriminated against because of that. Um, and so that fear is very real, and particularly as they age and they may feel more vulnerable to situations where that discrimination may take place.
Yeah, Danielle's also commented about having a stand at Pride events.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fantastic idea.
And we've still got the comment from Emma there about working with other sectors in a multidisciplinary way. I know you're going to cover some of some of that in your discussion around the focus groups, aren't you? A bit
Hmm.
bit later on.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen again now. There we are. Yeah, so it was a real challenge for us because um as I mentioned, the traditional ways of us accessing survivors was not available, and you've come up with some great suggestions there within the chat, and so some of which we did actually do, and I'll talk through those at each step in terms of the approach that we took. But what I want to do is actually for us to watch the end product of this whole co-production first. So the film is only about 6 minutes long. It appears to be quite simply put together, but actually there were a number of steps that we had to take to reach this end product and to facilitate that genuine co-production. And the reason I wanted to show it to you first was to see what the project is, and then to really examine in depth some of those steps that we had to take to reach it. So the film, as Elise mentioned, does come with a health warning. The survivors' voices within the film do describe their experiences of the abuse. So if you would like to take a break at any point, then I please do encourage you to do so. Within the film, it does highlight 4 hidden voices from the LGBTQ community. Um, and it looks at those lived experiences from the ages of 55 to 75 years of age. The film by no means is all encompassing of all LGBTQ plus individuals, but instead it is intended to be a conversation starter to explore the hidden issue. So let me, okay. Can you let me know, Elise, if you can hear the audio once it starts?
Yes, that's fine.
I'd never actually had a proper relationship with anyone before. And he was the first one that actually showed any real interest. For the first 6 months before I moved in with him, he didn't actually hit me, but he would be really offensive and really verbally abusive to me.
I was in a relationship with somebody who was emotionally abusive and who was quite a lot younger than me.
My longest relationship became abusive towards the end. It was basically the ignoring, living his life in orbit with me, but as if I wasn't there.
But then after about a year or so, that's when he started getting very violent and we'd argue a lot. And I'd get hit. And I'd get really upset. Still more, as I say, and he'd come round a couple of days later, begging me to take him back and stuff. And I did.
I was with my ex-partner for 25 years. He knew I was bisexual from the beginning, but what he couldn't accept was that I was going to leave him for a woman. He called me a dirty lesbian slag, you're filthy, and forced me to have sex.
She became very possessive. She was jealous of any time I spent with other people. I knew that I needed to leave the relationship. After we had officially split up, she was being more and more demanding of me emotionally, going to things that I was going to go to and then bursting into tears. It made me feel professionally embarrassed.
He pushed me to get rid of all my friends. I didn't have the confidence to get back in touch with them. So I was totally on my own.
I was really depressed and I felt like there was nowhere I could go or be where she wasn't going to pursue me. And that all my friendship circles and activities had been invaded by her. And I really felt in despair, actually. And that is abuse.
I found it hard to tell people what happened. Someone asked me why I stayed with him. I don't even know that. I think it was because of my lack of confidence.
I've been very wary about getting into any other relationships. It's led to me being more isolated.
I just became more and more depressed, anxious. The depression became suicidal. I have this memory of asking myself, why is nobody approaching me when I've stepped over a parapet and I'm standing on the edge of a bridge? Why are these people driving past, ignoring me?
Being of a certain age, you are more invisible. You're dismissed. But you know, abuse is a funny thing. You get used to it.
If you're feeling frightened, if you're feeling persecuted, intimidated, those are really valid feelings, and you must seek help.
Okay. There we are. So that was the short film that we ended up co-producing as part of this work. And it actually took us 41 months to make, so a very significant period of time to get to that end product, really. And I'm going to talk through now each step that we took to get to that end product, but also what was really important in ensuring that, you know, going back to those key characteristics of co-production, you know, that they had a sense of voice, they had a sense of ownership over that film, that we were all kind of aiming to reach a common kind of shared goal in raising the profile of this very hidden population of individuals. And I've highlighted here that we'll go through five of the core steps, but we have written a research paper that outlines this in a lot more depth if you wanted to explore that. And please feel free to ask questions along the way. We will pause for questions as well throughout. But if you do have anything that you'd like to ask, please use the chat function to be able to do that. Okay, so we wanted to explore this issue. We've just talked about some of those kind of challenges that we had, but we also were very aware that as a research team, we were predominantly cisgendered, heterosexual individuals. And therefore, we were aware that how we had understood domestic abuse was predominantly through this like a heteronormative gaze. So to access and engage with older LGBT survivors and the subject matter, we first had to acknowledge our own prejudices, any of our unconscious biases that might have really skewed the ways that we had understood domestic abuse in later life. So we wanted to learn a lot more about older LGBTQ plus survivors in terms of the domestic abuse, the current policy and the practice. And just to highlight, I suppose, one of my own unconscious biases that I had was that as a feminist researcher, my understanding of domestic abuse was very much centered around gender inequality and abuse as an expression of male dominance in a patriarchal society. And this way of thinking doesn't always lend itself to understanding the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals. So it doesn't really provide an appropriate lens really for understanding maybe same-sex relationships where there's two females within that relationship. So throughout the learning process, the research team, alongside the film crew, were really open to learning and of new ways of thinking about a subject matter. We didn't really have any kind of fixed ideology. We were willing to challenge our own constructions of how we'd interpreted knowledge and ways of understanding knowledge. And we adopted an autoethnographic approach, which really is the process of involving high levels of self and group reflection in terms of how we positioned ourselves. So we all took time to really consider, you know, how do we understand domestic abuse and our interpretations and the frameworks and the policy that we draw on, and then how can we then use that understanding to explore LGBTQ plus individuals, and where are the limitations of those gaps, and really challenging one another in that construction of knowledge. We looked at other alternative theories that we hadn't maybe considered before, for example, the queer theory, which looks at individuals and structures of power within society rather than this binary of male and female power. But we also explored some of the political, ethical and methodological aspects around conducting this research. So we wanted to learn a lot more about the the backdrop of LGBT communities in terms of their culture and their social political history. So we undertook training with a specialist organisation called Opening Doors. We engage with LGBTQ plus specific charities to learn about the nature of relationships in later life. And because there was such a limited understanding of LGBT and domestic abuse and older people, we started to look at, okay, so what does other literature tell us? What do we know about older LGBTQ plus relationships more generally? And through that, we found out that they were more likely to be estranged from their biological family members. They're less likely to have had children than their heterosexual counterparts. They were experiencing really high levels of discrimination within social care and health environments. And this really helped to understand the context in which some of these domestic abuse experiences were happening. But we were also really aware that we needed to not influence the data in terms of our understandings from a heterosexual point of view, and that we really needed to facilitate a safe space for individuals who were LGBTQ plus to share their experiences openly in a way that they felt safe without fear of judgment, without fear of any discrimination from a heterosexual gaze kind of looking in. And so what we did was we really worked with the LGBTQ plus film crew to upskill them in this kind of process of conducting the research themselves. And we'll get into that in just a little bit now, but because we were making a film, we first of all, as I mentioned, had to recognise our own unconscious biases, but we also had to look at what else was available in terms of this subject matter. So we conducted a visual scoping exercise where we explored existing media, including public campaigns and short films. And through this exercise, we found that the discourse was very much around younger people. When they was exploring LGBTQ plus domestic abuse, it was looking at physical forms of abuse. They were often presenting with alcohol and substance dependency. And this presented a very obscured view of domestic abuse. Now, we know that these are issues that the LGBTQ plus and heterosexual communities face, but the conversation was very much focused all around that. And it really limited our understanding in terms of does coercive and controlling behaviour look like in those relationships? How does it impact on individuals' lives and their future relationships? But there was very little reference points really for us to consider. We knew that the majority of these short films that were created by activists within the LGBT community themselves and were very low budget. So we were mindful of that. But through this visual scoping exercise, the research team, the filmmaker, and the help of 4 student volunteers, 3 of which were queer, bisexual, and transgender, we critically considered the script, the filming style, the tone, the relationship that these films had to the literature that we had learnt about. And we found that the films were often ageist, and they weren't exploring those complexities of domestic abuse. So this visual scoping exercise really served a purpose to help us recognise almost what we didn't want the film to look like, and what we wanted to challenge really in terms of that knowledge construction, when we were co-creating a new film. And what imagery we wanted to use, and which ones we wanted to not use. So, as I mentioned, as a predominantly heterosexual and cisgendered team, we wanted to reduce that risk of placing a heterosexual lens on the data collection. So, as a research team, we really had to relinquish our power and pass direct control to LGBTQ plus stakeholders. So we were aware that we didn't want to further oppress a population, and that it really needed to be driven and voiced by the older LGBT community. And our position really was to facilitate that process, to almost to take a back seat and have a role in upskilling and giving them the tools to be able to drive this forward for themselves. And our first step really was to speak to practitioners. So we wanted to see if we could learn about the lived experiences through practitioners who may or may not be supporting older LGBTQ plus people. So we hired a consultant really from the LGBTQ plus community who had a really good reputation of working in the fields of gender and sexuality, and is an inclusive approach to examining the issue. With the LGBT facilitator, we held 2 focus groups with a total of 28 practitioners. One was held in London and the other was held in Brighton. And we invited practitioners from health and social care, from LGBT organisations, from age-related organisations, and also domestic abuse specialists. So we had a real cross-section of voices, and a multidisciplinary response really into the needs of these older people. But it was important to note that none of the practitioners were aged 65 years or older. So this was a limitation in terms of gaining that older lived experiences of abuse. Professionals' perceptions of barriers and enablers, they said that they felt quite restricted because they had very poor visibility of older LGBT accessing their services. And there was a notable lack of knowledge really across all 3 intersections of older age, sexuality and domestic abuse. There were practitioners who had really good understanding of LGBT in older age, and there were practitioners who had really good understanding of domestic abuse in LGBT. But to have all 3 dimensions of the age, gender, sexuality and the domestic abuse was very, very limited. So with the help of the LGBT facilitator, we created a safe space for discussion where, as a research team, we kept a very low profile. We didn't really interact much within the focus group sessions at all. We were very much letting the participants to lead that conversation and take that forward. And we wanted them to build on each other's knowledge and positively challenge one another without that kind of heterosexist gaze. So typically in a focus group, the researchers will probe and they'll dig deeper and delve deeper into subject matters. But we really sat back and let the group do that for one another instead. And it was interesting because they almost acted as kind of co-researchers in this environment, and they, positively and constructively challenged one another in terms of their views and their understandings of the subject matter, and really drove that conversation and the direction of that conversation forward, with the help of the LGBTQ plus facilitator in that environment. But we also became aware within that group setting that there was a sense of hierarchy in terms of the LGBT community, that a white male, gay male's voice had more dominance within those settings than maybe the female trans voice that we was also gleaning. And sometimes there was a little bit of tension arising in terms of the differences across the sexualities. So what we did is we audio recorded all of the conversations, then we sent them to transcription. And with the consent of all individuals, we sent the full transcripts out to everyone who had participated in the focus group. And we asked them to provide additional comments on the transcript that they may or may not have felt comfortable giving in that group setting, or that they had given it more consideration and wanted to add to that. Um, and lots of the stakeholders who took part in the focus groups really valued having this additional way of feeding in that input. And they said that they felt that they could share their views that were free from scrutiny of some of the peers. So that worked really well in terms of getting that kind of second input from those individuals. We also gave the opportunity that they could speak with the LGBT facilitator again if they wanted to individually, but it appeared that everyone was happy to provide the written feedback instead. So the group really served a number of purposes in that we recognised even more so the invisibility of older LGBT people, and the need to kind of amplify their voices through the subject matter. But also the additional challenges that we were going to face in terms of accessing the lived experiences of the older LGBT people. All of the stakeholders who took part in the focus groups said that they would make a combined effort to look at their current service users and see if there would be anyone who would be interested in speaking to the research team. There were introductory emails sent as well to colleagues to invite them to engage with older LGBT individuals, to invite them. But we had no response at all. Not one person came forward wishing to take part in the research, and a lot of the feedback from the stakeholders were that they had difficulty identifying anybody who would meet the age range and the criteria that we were looking to speak to. So what we did was we had to go deep into the community setting. So one of you mentioned this earlier as a potential option to explore. Christian, our filmmaker, he went deep into community settings to speak to older LGBTQ plus people about the work and what it was we were doing, in the hope that people would be interested in taking part. But in order for Christian to be able to do that, we had to equip him with the skills to be a qualitative researcher. So his expertise was around filmmaking and, kind of post-production and pre-production work. And he didn't really have any understanding of how and what techniques you need to engage with older survivors to capture that lived experience. So we worked with Christian over several months to really upskill him as a researcher, and so he felt confident in a position to be able to go out and do this work. And in turn, Christian really upskilled us around filmmaking, what were the essentials that was needed in terms of the script development, how scripts need to be formulated. And we worked with Christian to design a interview schedule that the film crew also gave input into, that he would then speak to victim survivors about. But it was really important that we gave this power to Christian and relinquished our power as researchers to Christian, because he was also from the LGBT community, so he was relatable to an extent in a way that maybe us as a cisgendered heterosexual research team were not. And we wanted older LGBT individuals to feel safe to disclose, and that was really important, that they felt a sense of safety, but also to start that process of feeling in control and gaining ownership over their narratives and the co-creation of the film. So Christian went out to different community groups. He went to theatre groups, he went to voluntary groups, individually organised groups that were all identified as LGBTQ plus specific groups. He introduced himself as a filmmaker, said what it was that we were looking to produce in terms of a short film. And that he was looking for people to share their experiences around relationships in later life. So he's very much taken this very broadly, saying he was looking to talk about healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. And through that introductory work with these community groups, he had 14 individuals that contacted him and disclosed domestic abuse. And that abuse was a combination of current and historic. And many of these individuals had experienced multiple forms of abuse right across their life course. And it's very clear from their experiences that that had significantly impacted them in older age. So they'd sent an email or phoned Christian to outline their situation. And all 14 had said, actually, no, 13 of the 14 had said that they'd never told anyone about the abuse before. And this involvement in the project had really led to a sense of validation of their experiences. So Christian then agreed to meet with each of the 14 individuals. But it was really important to Christian and also to the research team that the contributors were not viewed as sources of information, but rather that they were valued and they were given control over how their stories had unfolded. So typically within research, it can be viewed, the research interview can be viewed as an extraction process, whereby the researcher goes in, asks questions, expects the individual to open up and to disclose really personal stories about their own lives. And we didn't feel that that would be appropriate in these situations, and that in order for them to feel that they had control, they got to decide as and when they shared elements of their story. So the director spent months getting to know these individuals. They went for coffees, they went for chats and walks. He learnt all about their kind of their whole life story, really. They shared elements of the domestic abuse as and when they felt comfortable to. There was no recording of any interviews or anything taking place at this point. It was very much learning about them and their experiences. And also inviting them to take part further in the co-production activities. So when it was felt that Christian had a strong and trusting relationship with the individuals, the recording of the interviews had taken place. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had put together an interview schedule as a research team and the filmmaker, but in reality, that schedule was never used because through that relationship building with Christian, he and that person has identified the key things that they felt was important to them in terms of capturing that story, and they actually worked with Christian to say which questions they wanted to be asked, which questions they felt comfortable in being asked, and what they felt they needed to be asked within that guided conversation to for people to understand what their lived experiences of that domestic abuse were. So they really co-constructed that interview schedule. Then Christian spoke to them. They recorded the conversation. They could take breaks at any point that they wanted to. The recording of the interview was actually only 1 hour long, but he'd spent most of the day with these individuals, preparing them beforehand, having debrief sessions after, taking breaks in between as well. And once those kind of 14 stories were gathered, Christian also invited them to take part in the filming of the Do You See Me? Not in the way that they were filmed and present as actors, but how they could contribute to the actual production of the film. And 4 of those 14 individuals said they wanted to be part of that process. They wanted to see how their kind of stories would come to life. But also the 4 of them had volunteered for their script to be used within that film. So on the film that you saw, Do You See Me? The narratives that you hear and the audio of those narratives are actually from the interviews with the older LGBT individuals, and they were snippets of that the script that has been taken and then placed within the film. So we really worked with the 4 collaborators to help construct the script. So we had 27 hours of audio that we managed to squeeze into this kind of 6-minute film. And we had this interesting process of competing narratives. So the research team were coming with their own agenda in terms of how they wanted the film to look, and how the film director had his agenda, and also the survivors had their own agenda as well. So for the filmmaker, he was very keen on having the film that was had high impact for audiences. So he felt that accounts of physical abuse would really achieve this. Whereas as the research team, we were keen to dispel some of those myths around domestic abuse, that it's not only physical abuse. So we wanted to show some of more of those subtleties around the coercive and controlling behaviour. And for the survivors, they really wanted the film to illustrate the significant impact that the abuse had had over their lives in terms of isolation and future relationships. So what we had was this almost competing narratives of the script development, and some tensions really in terms of what should be included and what shouldn't be included. And I've got a quote here from some of the autoethnographic accounts that we were writing at the time, where it says the director was keen to keep in elements of the victim's story that had the shock factor. It was a balancing act to create something that was impactful, but did not feed into the idea that domestic abuse was only physical and sexual violence. So upskilling the director in domestic abuse and coercive control was a continuous process. So we were constantly talking about the nature and dynamics of domestic abuse, the importance of looking at the coercive and controlling behaviour, and almost coming to like a mutual agreement that yes, the physical violence is important and is an element of their story, but also some of these subtleties around the isolation, around the ignoring behaviour, were also really important in that narrative construction. But ultimately, really, the decision of the overall script was left to the survivors to decide. So it was what they felt was most important about their story that they wanted us to capture. And it was an interesting exercise, really, because when we had their full script in its entirety, and then we highlighted individually, the researcher, the filmmaker, the survivor, aspects of those the scripts that was important. We almost had different sections of the script of importance, and so we all had to come together and reach a common goal, really, in terms of what is it that this film is really serving, what is it that we really need to do in terms of filling the gap of knowledge, and how can we do that with the information that we have already. And then the script was developed, really. So in the film, for example, we'll call the lady Maggie. Her name's not really Maggie. She talked about stalking behaviour and manipulation by the perpetrator within group settings, and also a post-separation abuse that she experienced, and now this heightened her sense of isolation. And she really wanted that aspect of her story to be included within that script. And so it was important that we found a way to make sure that was included, and that was at the forefront of her experiences. So the script development took a number of months to do. As I mentioned, there was numerous tensions, but we finally agreed on a script that everybody, all three, was happy with, and most importantly, the survivor was happy with. And then it was moving really into the film production. So survivors here their involvement was really essential. They collaborated with Christian to help make the film. They went on set, so they were there. They helped choose the actors that represented them as individuals. They decided what the actors wore to represent them, because they really wanted that sense of self within their actor. So they decided on the clothing that they wore, the props that they used. So, for example, one of the survivors is doing a crochet within the film, and that was really important to her. It had really helped her in her recovery. So she really felt that was she wanted that individual to be doing that at the time. They also decided on the positioning and how they sat. There's one gentleman who used a walking aid through a walking stick. He really wanted to have a strong presence with that walking stick, really, and show with his bracelets on that he was proud to use the stick, or that it didn't really hinder in any way. It was just something that he needed as assistance. So they really helped direct the film in terms of what was done, the shots that were used. There's a scene with the one of the older women who is stroking the curtain at one point, and that was what one of the survivors was doing on set while she was listening to the script. And so it was felt that, you know, that would also be appropriate to be used as filming within that. So they were really active agents, really, in this whole process, and Christian really facilitated in an environment where they were almost taking control of the direction and the directing of that film throughout that kind of experience, and really that followed through into the post-production process. So in terms of the music and how that music sounded, they wanted the film to convey a deep sense of isolation, because that was a really common theme for all of the survivors in the aftermath of the violence. So they helped, you know, decide on the music as well in terms of that co-construction. I'm just going to pause there, because I appreciate that was quite a lot of information to take in terms of each of the steps that we took for co-creating this film, and I just want to see if there's any questions up until now.
Nothing in the chat at the moment, Rebecca, but I think it is a good idea to to pause, having seen the film and then have more detail about the process behind it. I'm sure that that's been quite a lot for people to reflect on. So possibly people are beginning to start formulating some questions. If you're not quite ready to put your questions in the chat or to sort of chat, good, there's one coming in from Janine there.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because we're developing some films with different service user groups as part of a filming project with students from Salford, filming students. And I suppose I just kind of wanted to ask, from your perspective, did you have a vision of what you wanted kind of the films to look like and things, and did that change over time? Because I think I had a vision for a particular film, and after speaking with people and people with lived experience and the filming students, that what I imagined changed very quickly over that duration. And I realized it was a lot of reflection for me, thinking about, well, I'm looking at it through my lens, but actually the point of the film is to see it through their lens. So it was a really good piece of reflection for myself. I just wondered whether you'd experienced the same.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think coming in as researchers with no understanding of film production and what's actually possible in terms of money and some of the limitations with that. Initially, we thought we'd have some sort of animation that would represent the lived experiences, but through the process of speaking directly with individuals, they really wanted themselves to be reflected within the film, which they didn't feel would be possible with the animation side. So they wanted real actors to be used. We had no idea in terms of the setting of where this film would take place. We wanted to glean the script first and what that was, and then once we had the script, then develop the mood and the kind of backdrop to that film. And it was really with Christian, his film crew, and the survivors and the researchers were separate to that process of saying, right, okay, what are we trying to convey here in terms of the mood and the atmosphere? Where is a setting could this potentially work? And they've picked this house that is there's elements of the modern in there with some of the curtains and some of the old and the derelict, and to really represent the kind of movement of the 20th century. So that there's those kind of connotations within that film that the survivors wanted it to feel like they were really isolated and alone within a space, and it didn't feel homely at all, along with the Christian and the filmmaking's view of how that could then be imagined within a space. So yeah, it was never a fixed idea in a sense, and it was then the script and them coming together of ideas and moods, and that then decided on the film.
I think there was a bit of a debate at one point, wasn't there, Rebecca, when you were narrowing down the script and the look on how a victim survivor is portrayed generally, isn't it? And what level of perhaps violence would be physical, in terms of physical violence, would be discussed or not. Are you happy to talk us through the thought process that went behind what elements of the survivor's story were brought through and how those decisions were made?
Yeah, so just really going back to the slide on the quotes here, I think it was important for the survivors not, and for us as a research team, not to show the aspects of the physical violence. We'd seen that previous films that had been made had really looked into that, and they'd been quite impactful. But the survivors also felt that the demonstration of that physical violence was unnecessary. and that actually they wanted to talk more about the impact that had on their life decisions. And most of these survivors had not entered into another relationship in a later life. It really significantly impacted on their trust of individuals, to be able to do that. So they also wanted to challenge some of those ageist assumptions. They drew on kind of reference points of older people when they're usually used in campaigns. They've got the gnarled hands, their hands are over their face. And it is a typical kind of eye stalk imagery, really, which is used, and they felt that that made them even more invisible. So those close footage shots of their face and zooming in, they felt was really important because it was highlighting them as an actual person, and that you know gave a window through their kind of eyes in terms of who they were as individuals, rather than just somebody staring out of a window, which is a side profile on with kind of gnarled hands.
Yeah, and I think that goes sort of full circle in some ways, right back to some of the focus groups in the early stages of the whole project, isn't it? At the beginning of Dewis Choice, with when we showed visual representations of older people in the media to some of those focus group participants, and they felt that there was a lot of shorthand used to reflect an older person, wasn't there? So,
Mm.
so the use of grey hair, the use of, like you said, gnarly hands and whatever, they saw that very clearly. They identified that those were shortcuts. Oh, here we go. It's an older person that you're seeing now, rather than, and in some ways, the actual individual was lost in that imagery. And I think that's what really does come across in the final cut of the film, doesn't it? The very individualized nature of abuse and looking at that intersectional qualities of the individual.
Yeah, and I suppose that the benefits really of having the filmmaker and his skill set, and alongside the survivors. So the survivors knew that they didn't want these ageist attitudes and they wanted to be seen as a person. And then the filmmaker knowing how to create that through these close-up shots, really complementing that process, but really being driven by the survivors' wishes in terms of how they were presented. Yeah. Okay.
There's not anything coming through in the chat, but please do, even if you want to add a reflection on sort of how the feel of the film, please do feel free to put that in the chat as we carry on.
Yeah, and just to look at some of the key learning really. So throughout this process, what was really apparent is that we we all as collaborators had different skill sets to contribute towards the production of the film, but also the need to upskill one another in these different skill sets, to recognize, particularly for the survivors, to feel like they were in a position to equally contribute towards the production of the film. Um, so that involved, as I mentioned earlier, the upskilling with the uh, director and the film team around research skills, the upskill them in exchange, upskilling us around LGBTQ plus individuals. So there was a real need for that reciprocal and continuous learning throughout the whole process, and really being highly reflective as a group, being able to feel safe to challenge one another in terms of their views, and be open to that challenge, in order to really recognize some of our maybe unconscious biases. The importance of handing that power really into the LGBT community. So researchers really relinquishing that power so that there was a safe space for the survivors and practitioners to make comments on the LGBTQ plus individuals. But also around the the real value for co-production for the survivors that have been involved within this process. So, as I mentioned, they'd never told anyone about their experiences before, but they felt a real sense of validation about their victimization. It really challenged some of their own self-blame that they had for the abuse that they had experienced, and their desire really for to make a positive change that so other victim survivors would know about the help and support that was available, and to know really that they weren't alone. And the film ends on a quote from one of the ladies that says, you know, "You're not alone. There is help and support available." And for her, that was really important that that message was embedded within the film. So the kind of goal was to support other victim survivors throughout this process. But I think none of this would have been possible without the flexibility of our funder. So we'd secured money from the National Community Fund for this project. We thought it would take up to 12 months to produce. But given the challenges we faced with accessing the group, and also you know, the limited knowledge and understanding, it did take the 41 months. But having a funder that really recognises the value of co-production and how to facilitate that in a genuine way takes a lot of time and effort, and also a lot of relationship building and trust exercises that need to be completed in order to have these spaces to reflect and to challenge one another was really, really important. So alongside producing the short film, I mentioned that we had 27 hours of audio and we've condensed that into 6 minutes. We really wanted to make sure that all 14 voices of the survivors that we caught, that we captured as part of the research were reflected, and that we were sharing those in meaningful ways, really, to um, encourage more of a discussion about this topic within policy and practice settings. So traditionally in research, you know, academics will produce a research publication, often it has a firewall, and so the readership of those publications can sometimes be quite limited in terms of who gets to access it. Um, and we wanted the survivors who'd contributed to feel like they had more meaning, and that they was bringing about more positive change within society. So I'm just putting a question out really to you in terms of what else do you think we could have done with our research findings other than write a research paper that would have the benefit of a public good really in terms of making change within communities. So what methods maybe do you use as practitioners or students when learning about subject matters? Like what works for you as a format?
Just giving people time to get into in the chat. I can see Janine's popping something in the chat now, and a couple of others actually are joining in on the chat. So Sam has said looking at previous research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've got also research again there. Go to groups and services and share findings. So I'm presuming from that's that sort of in-person sharing of findings, going out to give talks and discussion groups.
Yes. Was there an event to present the video to share with group students and practitioners? Yeah, so we have held a number of events with different groups of people, really, some within community settings, some with our student population. and some with other academics and practitioners as well, around the film. I mean, unfortunately, when the film was released, COVID-19 lockdown was happening, so we had intended to have a film screening where we would invite all of the collaborators and a range of professionals, and actually some of the survivors has identified key people that they felt needed to be there at the film screening. But due to the restrictions, we actually wasn't able to do that, which was unfortunate. So the film was screened by Warner Brothers and HBO Max as part of LGBT History Month back June 2 years ago, I think it was. But yes, we are still sharing the film. And we've put it on our YouTube channel as well, which is free for people to access so that we can get that wider reach. See knowledge from other practitioners, especially if they've experienced in the subject matter. Yeah. We did. Sorry, go on, Elise.
I was thinking we've also embedded it as a training tool, haven't we, as well? So we do deliver quite a considerable amount of training on different intersections of domestic abuse in later life, and one of those being a training specifically on working with and responding to older LGBTQ plus victims, survivors. So we do embed the film as part of that training, don't we, to bring that lived experience into the training room.
Janine, have you connected with Safeguarding Adults Hubs to look at safeguarding reviews?
We did have we had some domestic homicide reviews that we looked at, didn't we, in the early stages before developing the film, but not really safeguarding reviews. And also there is a potential really for a learning event with adult safeguarding. And so the film has been used with adult safeguarding and social work practitioners in terms of parts of training events, but actually to partner it with some safeguarding reviews, it probably would make quite a powerful resource actually as a joint event. So that's worthy of exploration, I think.
Yeah, I'm the older survivors were really keen as collaborators to get this film out as wide as possible. They suggested that it go through some sort of media platform, through a newspaper like The Guardian or one of the big papers. And we tried really hard to get it within a news article. However, we had some feedback from a journalist that said domestic abuse in later life is not a sexy subject. People don't want to talk about it. And when you add the intersection of sexuality and gender, it's almost a taboo. So they said that we wouldn't really get any media coverage for the subject matter because it would be too uncomfortable for readers to comprehend. So we this is why we went to try and do the film screenings, etc. instead. But we couldn't even get LGBTQ plus specific community news is to publicize it either. And the feedback was that LGBT individuals are already experiencing discrimination, and they didn't want to highlight an issue that was of which could negatively impact on them and how they were perceived. So there was also a reluctance really to raise awareness of this domestic abuse within their own LGBTQ plus community. So we did face a number of barriers in terms of getting media to promote this work. In the end, we did our own social media campaign, and we got key individuals like Peter Tatchell,
Peter Tatchell, yeah.
yeah, to promote it, and other key LGBTQ plus individuals within the community to promote it with on social media.
And I think that's a really important point you've raised about a lot of the LGBTQ plus events that are taking place, and sort of around the History Month and around Pride events. A lot of those are really about celebrating the advances and the steps that they've made in sort of the increasing visibility and tackling prejudice and discrimination, aren't they? So actually to then situate this subject in that context that may be seen to shine a negative light, it was a bit of a reluctance then to sort of to sit it there. So it was sort of where it sat was quite complex, wasn't it, really?
Yeah. So what we also did then was we oh, there we are. We created a practitioner film. So we used the information from the focus groups, and also from 4 key individuals really around practitioners working in the subject area, to create a film for practitioners in terms of what they could do to positively respond to domestic abuse and LGBT in later life. And I will show this film in just a moment. We also created a podcast because we had feedback from practitioners that they wanted to engage with some of the literature, but that the time was limited really. But maybe if it was in an audible format, they could listen to it on their way into work or when they was out going for a walk. So we created a podcast, and one of those episodes looks specifically at the experiences of older LGBTQ plus individuals, and some of the stories from the other the 14 people are embedded within there as well. So we was able to use their stories, and that was particularly important for the trans voice, because we wasn't able to cover the trans lived experience within the film, because they weren't able to contribute towards the production of the film. But we wanted to make sure we were still raising the profile of trans lived experiences, and so we've done that through the podcast. And we also produced then a practitioner good practice guide. So we used all of the information that we gleaned about the barriers and enablers to seeking help from an older LGBTQ plus person's perspective, and all of the information that we gleaned from the focus groups with the practitioners, to put together this good practice guide, which can be accessed on our website and is free for you to download. And then, as Elise mentioned, then we've done specific work around training and consultancy within this subject matter, and looking at upskilling the workforce really in terms of responding to LGBTQ plus individuals' needs. We will be disseminating all of the slides where you can have access to. There's links on this slide to all of the resources that we've talked about, in addition with some other resources that we do have available. But I would like to show you now the practitioner film really, that is designed to complement and sit next to the Do You See Me film. It is filmed in the same setting, and so you will recognise the background, and it also stars Elise, who is here on the call with you today, along with Peter Kelly from Gallup, and Rhys Dower, who was formerly at the LGBT Foundation, and Matty Herring from Opening Doors.
Starting with a blank page can be overwhelming. Grammarly gives you a head start.
Apologies for
Simply
the
type a
advert.
prompt to instantly
Can you see that okay, Elise?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Domestic abuse is often hidden.
For an older person experiencing domestic abuse, it's often overlooked.
For an older person who is LGBTQ+, domestic abuse is invisible.
My name's Rhys Dower. I'm the Domestic Abuse Coordinator of LGBT Foundation based in Manchester.
I'm Megan Herring and I work for Opening Doors London, where I'm the Befriending Coordinator.
I'm Peter Kelly. I am from Gallup and we are an LGBT plus anti-violence charity.
My name's Elise Freeman and I'm a wellbeing practitioner and service development lead with the Dewis Choice project. Domestic abuse is a single incident or a pattern of behaviour that's harmful from an intimate partner, an ex-intimate partner or a family member, regardless of age, gender or sexuality.
What does LGBT DV look like in short? Well, it looks like DV. So it looks like verbal abuse, coercive control, physical violence, economic abuse, sexual violence, and so on. The difference is, I think, people, because of their identities, experience that in a different way to heterosexual or cisgendered people. So, for example, one of the most common experiences is having your sexuality or gender identity used against you.
A perpetrator can also be from a family of choice, and for an older person who is LGBTQ+, their family may consist wholly or partly of a family of choice, and that is when you form close bonds and relationships with people who aren't related to you biologically or through marriage, but form very similar relationships.
There's many different forms of relationships, not just the monogamous relationship. Are we considering polyamorous relationships, open relationships, where there's consent for other people to be in that relationship, whether that's sexually, emotionally, physically? And if we are aware of those relationships, are we considering that those people could also potentially be part of that abuse?
What's the public story of domestic abuse? It's often around a heterosexual, cisgendered woman. And that's understandable given the proportionality and what we know about the nature of gender-based violence. But the problem for older LGBT people is they're often invisible. So they're often invisible not only in their own communities, but they're also invisible to services.
With regards to general statistics, we know that it's 1 in 4 LGBT people that are experiencing abuse, and this is at the same rate as non-LGBT people. So what we know about older LGBT victims of domestic abuse is that they are underrepresented across the board with services nationally, but they're also an under-researched area. So the research that we do have really is around younger victims and midlife adult victims. So older LGBT victims of domestic abuse are really omitted in the academia. So therefore services are more targeted at younger people rather than older LGBT people.
People often think, well, why do I need to make inclusive spaces? Why do I need to have a space specifically for LGBT plus people? I'm just going to treat everyone the same. But we're not all the same. Our very histories are very, very different.
Practitioners coming into contact with older people who are LGBTQ+ are not identifying their sexuality. And this is partly because they're not asking the questions. Some of them are uncomfortable talking about sexuality with older people. Older people are often seen as asexual, and it's an important part of their identity. For an older person experiencing domestic abuse, it can take a long time for them to fully disclose the extent of the abuse. People who are working with Dewis Choice are disclosing quite high levels of abuse months after the event, and that's through building a relationship of trust with their support worker.
Professionals can respond better to the needs of LGBT people by, first of all, recognising that they are experiencing abuse. So looking for those signs and giving them space to talk and discuss. And also, we find going at their own pace and not judging them, not making assumptions about their relationship, and really just giving them opportunities to make choices and decisions themselves about how they want to navigate that relationship, whether it's a family or a relationship of their own choosing.
We need to be aware of our subconscious bias when we're supporting LGBT victims of domestic abuse. We need to be making sure that we're providing that appropriate support so that we can do the best to our abilities to make sure that person is in a safe environment. We need to be taking a multi-agency approach with regards to our service users. We need to be aware of our organisational skills and our competencies and what we feel confident with providing, but also being aware of what external organisations can provide to make sure that service users' needs are fully fulfilled.
The most important thing any service could do is to go get training for yourselves, get training for all of your staff. Learn from other organisations that are doing this so that when you do get LGBT plus people coming to you, that you do feel confident.
It's about making your service visible to LGBT victims and survivors, and that can be through images, it can be through the language you use, taking a robust anti-discriminatory practice really, and that cuts across with all staff. So, when someone walks into that service, they are going to feel that that service is inclusive and they're not going to be discriminated against or belittled because of their sexuality or gender identity.
Make sure we're asking these people about their pronouns, their gender. I know this feels uncomfortable, but this is empowering for an LGBT person to be asked these questions. We need to be aware that there are new language, there are new concepts and terms that we are using, and this can be difficult, and that's okay if we don't understand this, but use that curiosity to your advantage. Speak to your local LGBT organisations or look them up yourself, because it's that curiosity that drives change.
Okay. So, is there any questions or comments in terms of what has been discussed today that's anybody would like to ask?
There's some typing going on in the chat. I think if you've had to leave a bit early to go into meetings, we know the pressure of back-to-back meetings, don't we? With no time for comfort breaks in between.
The films were very powerful and informative. Thank you, Swisher. This has been excellent. Oh, thank you, Sam. Yeah, I think everyone who's contributed towards the films have been really, really happy with the outcomes. They are really pleased with them, and we hope that they'll have benefits for practitioners and also victim survivors as well, in terms of opening up that conversation around this subject matter that is often hidden. You're probably Kelly.
Sorry if you can hear my dog. I'm not sure if you can hear him. He's going crazy at the door now. Oh, that's nice. A very good eye-opening session. Thank you for the feedback. Be interesting to hear BAME voices too, where possible.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this group is already extremely hidden, as older LGBTQ plus, and when you start to add the intersections of the BAME as well, really hard to reach population. One of the survivors' voices in the story, she was mixed race, and the elements of her story and narrative didn't really highlight some of those additional barriers that she faced based on that. And she didn't really want to talk about her race as part of that story. So we didn't include it. But yeah, you're absolutely right there, Chris, that there's a lot more that needs to be done around BAME and older age in general, really, I think, as well as the intersection of sexuality.
Definitely.
Okay. There we are then. Well, our contact details are on the slide above, and as we mentioned, they will be sent out, the slides. So please do feel free to reach out if you've got any questions or comments, really. But thank you very much for all those that have attended.
I have popped links a couple of times in the chat to the resources as well, so where you can go and check out our resources and download them and see the films and podcasts. I think Janine has also put a link in the slide to the feedback form, so please do make a bit of time today to do that and get that back to Janine. I'm not sure if there's any more asked, so just some thank yous coming through on the chat. But no, thank you for coming along and joining us for this session.
Yeah, thank you all, and have a good week.
Sound like there's some really exciting sessions coming up this week. I'm just going to stop the recording.